Give it a few minutes.
Well, are you gonna take off the glasses when you're Priyanka?
I don't know. I'm like, I need to read my notes.
No, I like it. I'm just, it's like, is it part of the costume or?
I'm at that weird age where it's like, it just makes things nice and crispy clear, but I can still read them without it.
Oh,
So
no,
it's like,
I hear you. I have glasses that I wear. I'm like, oh, things look good.
Hi, everyone. Just going to give it a few more minutes so we can get a critical mass in the room. And we're still waiting for one of our panelists. So let me just quickly check on that. But once that happens, we'll get started in a minute or two. All right. Okay, let me just check. Maybe one of these is ready. Okay. Just give us another 2 to 3 minutes. We'll get started. Okay, we're getting good attendance. Mala or Rohit, do you want to see if either of you have Ravi's phone number? Want to check
Yeah,
it
we
out?
text them.
Oh, there we go.
Here we go.
Great. Hi, Ravi. How are you?
I'm well. How are you guys?
Great.
I put on my cardigan.
All right, we'll get started since we're all on board. To all of you out here, my name is Tara Ragavan. I'm the president of Saba North America, and I'm very glad to welcome you to the Game of Immigration. We've got our 3 co-chairs of the immigration section on board to talk to you and play the game of immigration from both the US and Canadian perspective. Just going to introduce them one by one. First is Mala Bajpai. Mala is in Arizona and has been practicing immigration for a long time. We've got Ravi Jain. He's in Canada, in Toronto, I believe. And
Yes.
Ravi has been involved in immigration for, I don't know, 2+ decades, right, Ravi?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, that's right. And then we've got our youngster of the group, Rohit Biswas, and Rohit stateside in New Jersey. And,
New York, actually.
Oh, sorry, New York. My apologies. I promise I won't butcher
Sorry.
that next time. But I just want to get the conversation started. So I'm going to go dark, as I like to say, and then let these guys take it over.
Great. All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the game of life and how to win in US and Canadian immigration. So what we want to do is kind of go across the regulatory frameworks of both Canadian US immigration And we say it's a game of life because there's a couple of, decisions you might make, where you are in your life, all of that. And it involves chance and sometimes luck. And you kind of have to play the board and do what you're given. So we have our experts here, US and Canadian. So let's look at our players. We're going to be looking at it from the lens of a person from South Asia, because look at our association name. And so we're going to go to the next slide and look at our players, right? So go here. First, we have Mala, who is the working student. Second, we have Ravi, the parent. Third, we have Rohit and Rahul, cousins. Lolu, the bachelor getting married. And Priyanka, the girlfriend. Before we go on, these are all fictional characters. This is not legal advice. If you need legal advice, we recommend contacting an immigration attorney. But we'll have some fun and play the game of life. And Mala, Ravi, you guys ready?
We're
Oh,
ready.
I'm getting ready. Here we go.
Okay.
All right. Okay.
All right, Mala. Well,
This is what happens when you do a webinar close to Halloween. My Halloween costume box
It's
is
our
out of the
Halloween
garage.
just because we're attorneys doesn't mean we're not fun.
Exactly.
Immigration is really fun. And so, Mala, why don't you spin that wheel?
Okay, well, I wanted to just talk about a little bit about Priyanka though. First, she came as a F1 student, right? And she's a
Priyanka, yeah.
working student, so
Yep.
she has CPT, curriculum practical training. So she can work while she's studying. And then she just entered the H-1B lottery, right?
For Priyanka or Mala?
For Mala.
Yeah, there you go. Let's spin that wheel.
Let's spin my wheel.
All right, where did we land here? Mala, you didn't get a job after going to college to the United States.
Oh no, I thought I didn't get my H-1B lottery selection. So I couldn't start my job in October after graduating. So what are my options?
So Ravi, do you want to kind of, Mala didn't get her job, didn't get the H-1B lottery. Now she's thinking about going to Canada. Is that a viable option?
Potentially. So I'm in my dad cardigan, just for those of you who weren't, listening earlier. And I am generally the parent in later scenarios. But so that explains my somewhat unusual, but not that unusual, I guess. But in terms of my hat right now, I guess it's advising on Canadian immigration law. And if she, worked for a U.S. entity, but I guess she never ended up not getting a job in the States. Yeah. So I guess the bottom line is, if she had worked, I'll just preface it by going through that scenario. If she had worked even briefly, let's say she did her F1, then got OPT or whatever the designation is, and worked for a company that happens to have a subsidiary or parent in Canada, then she might have been able to do an intercompany transfer. And then we would have been able to potentially, after working for a year, look at Canadian permanent residence options. But if she's never worked, one option she may want to consider is potentially studying in Canada. Because if you study in Canada, potentially doing a master's, if she's done a basic bachelor's there, then we can look at getting her what's called a postgraduate open work permit after graduation. And then looking at various permanent residence options, whether it's provincial nominee programs, which is at the national level government. So we call it province. So provincial government as opposed to states. Provincial government level, they have different programs. We've got the Federal Express Entry program. Potentially, Priyanka, with that very stylish hair, you might attract.
This is Mala. Priyanka's coming later.
Oh, sorry. Okay. So you might attract a Canadian who'd be a romantic partner. If you live with that Canadian for a year, you might be able to get permanent residence that way. you married that Canadian, you might be able to get permanent residence that way. So there's various options potentially once you're actually in Canada.
Ravi, you mentioned like you could get a work permit after you study in Canada, and
Mhm.
you can apply for permanent residence immediately, even without an employer, or how does that work?
So if you're looking at one of the federal programs, typically you'd have to work at least a year, but not necessarily, believe it or not, because our system, which is called Express Entry, has two main feeders to it. So either based on having worked in Canada for a year, or potentially based on foreign work experience. So if Mala, had potentially worked before coming to the United States and had a few years of work experience, she might qualify under what's called the Federal Skilled Worker Program. So either of these two programs I just described lead to Express Entry, so that's a possibility. There's also provincial programs that have different criteria, some of which don't require a full year of work. So, again, she might qualify under, she had a couple of years of work experience, for instance, abroad, in the same role that she's doing in Canada and Ontario specifically. Then there's a foreign worker stream that allows her to apply for immigration right away. So, I mean, I don't want to get bogged down in too many,
Right.
complications, but I would just say that one thing that is attractive about Canada is that, there are various options to transition into permanent residence, and the ability to do so is usually within a year of working, at the end of the year or within a year of working. And then the process for getting immigration is potentially as low as 6 months.
Wow, that's amazing. So,
But I don't
Mala,
think she's ready to give up on her dream yet.
right,
of
what do you
US,
think?
though.
US, if she wants to stay in the US, Mala, what do we have for US immigration?
I think she could look for cap exempt employers who aren't subject to the H-1B cap. For example, institutes of higher education, the nonprofits that are associated with them, and government research entities. She could try to get a job with them, and they can hire her, sponsor her H-1B all year long and not be subject to cap limitations. If she happens to be from Australia, Chile, or Singapore, they have their own separate cap, which to my knowledge has never been reached. It's like 10,000 a year. It never fills
Right.
up. She might go back to India and work for a large corporation that after a certain amount of time, they could bring her back here as an L1 intercompany transfer. A lot of Indian companies are doing that. Or maybe she just decides to work on her master's and stay in F1 status and then, retry for the H-1B after she graduates. But she wouldn't be allowed to work, but at least she would be allowed to stay here. So it really depends on what she wants.
Are there any options, maybe if she's attending college, kind of CPT or OPT and STEM OPT? Can you explain that if there's maybe an avenue there?
Absolutely. So after graduation, most the students get 1 year of OPT, optional practical training, and it's not subject to any specific employer. They can really work anywhere, but so they have employment authorization for up to 1 year. And then if it's in a STEM field that her degree is in, she
And
can
what's
get
the STEM field again?
engineering, math, technology, science. In January, President Biden expanded the list of STEM degrees to include a lot more to make it very comprehensive. We could probably attach that in the chat, the list of degrees that now count for STEM. But then you get an additional 2 years. So the benefit to Mala would be that she could continue to enter the H-1B lottery each of those years that she has work authorization.
So Ravi had mentioned even without an employer, Mala could sponsor, get a permanent residence somehow within 6 months or a year. Is there an option here for you, Mala? Without an employer, if after a STEM OPT or OPT, if you've worked?
Well, the employer can sponsor her for perm, but she would need to have status to remain in the US while that's pending. So perms generally are taking 2 to 3 years in order to get, and then even getting that green card if you're from India will still take many, many years, as we know from the visa bulletin, if you're from India. So it's not as quick as Ravi in Canada. but there are options. The hard part about that is that it's employer driven. The perm process is all
Right.
employer driven. So it's really important when students are in their F1 and OPT to really find an employer that's willing to sponsor them and be committed to them for the long haul until they get their green card.
So I have a
Or
question.
I
So
would-
let's say that the person comes to Canada, becomes a permanent resident relatively quickly. 3 years later becomes a citizen of Canada, then uses the USMCA, former NAFTA, to go to the United States under a TN. Maybe they get an H1 if they're in the lottery because you can, transition to green card easier, or maybe they do an E2 or something, and which is a, based on investing, and the company takes off and they have 10 employees and lots of revenue. But I guess my question is, if they turned out to be Canadian and then became a Canadian and then entered as an H1 or whatever category and then tried to transition to green card, it's my understanding that they would still be subject to longer delays because although they're Canadian citizens now,
Mhm.
it's based on the fact of where they were born. Is that true?
Right. So there's these backlogs if you were born in India
Hmm.
and China, but for our purposes, India. There's almost maybe more, at least depending on the green card category, right? So there's different kinds of EB1, EB2,
Mhm.
EB3 classifications. So EB1, there's certain categories. So there's researchers, there's multinational managers, there's extraordinary ability. So there's no weight there. EB2 and EB3, kind of the more common, I would say, classification. There's probably around for people born in India around a 10-year wait, or more.
Interesting.
Yeah. So
Even though they gave up Indian citizenship to become Canadian, the system still sees them as Indian, even though they technically are not an Indian citizen and they are now Canadian citizen.
yeah,
something to
wherever you
note.
were born, and some people are Indian citizens born in Singapore, kind of in that sense they can apply right away for green
Right.
cards when they're available. So it's interesting because it's where you're born. So the system itself lends itself to, even if you're Canadian and you've given up, renunciated your Indian citizenship, we're going to still see you as born in India. The only, the safety net there is for H1B. There's certain, you can keep extending your H1B status until you're current to file a green card. So
Right.
there's a system, but you have to get picked on H1B, which is, not the greatest chances. It's about 30 to 40% usually. So Mala, what do you pick? Are you going to go to Canada or the US before we go on to the next round?
I think I'm going to go to Canada and become a permanent resident there. And take this wig off.
Go Raptors. Okay, so we'll go to the next slide. Ravi,
Okay.
you're the parent. Are you going to spin that wheel? Let's do it.
Yes, spin
All
it.
right, spin that wheel. See where we're headed. Ravi's here with the fam.
Oh, I love it.
Ravi, you and your kids are planning to travel into either US or Canada for your business.
Hmm.
What are you doing? Are you thinking Canada or US? Ravi, take us away.
Well, I can speak to the Canadian options anyway. There's obviously business visitor options. So if you're interested in buying a business or starting a business, you may be able to come as a business visitor. So there's a visa for that. It's very similar to the United States, I would imagine. Just applying as a business visitor. So they're going to look at your assets and they're going to look at the money in the bank and ties to India, presuming you're from India, and they're going to assess you. So not everyone is going to be able to get that kind of a visa, but that's one way to come. Another option is for people who simply want to come directly as permanent residents. And so that could be in the business category. We used to have a federal investor program that's gone. We used to have a federal entrepreneur program that's gone too. There's been, a lot of concern around passive investing and around, main applicants coming and then the family using the healthcare system, not paying into the tax base. And then the main applicants sort of just staying back, whether it's a factory in China or whether it's, operations in India or whatever, and not actually immigrating. So we got rid of those programs. We replaced the entrepreneur program with a startup visa program, which is an innovative program. And it's interesting because you get permanent residence unconditionally. So once you're a permanent resident, they don't check on you to see if your business is successful. They don't check to see if you've hired Canadians. But you do have to get a letter of support from a government-approved private entity.
Is that hard to do?
I mean, they don't want to lose their designation with the federal government. So, you know, it's not easy to do, I would say, but you do have to, you know, provide a solid business plan, and you have to show that that it's innovative, right? That's the key to this particular program. There's also other programs like the Ontario Provincial Nominee Program, where you've got to have a net worth of either 800,000 if you're within the Greater Toronto Area, well, that, and invest 600,000. And then this one is conditional, so you have to show you hired 2 Canadians, and there's lesser criteria if it's outside the Greater Toronto Area. But you have to show you've created, like I said, two jobs if you're inside, and 1 job if you're outside the Greater Toronto Area. So that's another program, and all the provinces have entrepreneur programs, so each one has their own criteria, but I just use that as an example. So that's another way to immigrate if you want to start a business or buy a business. So there are some good options, and kids can come if they're under 22 years old, but oftentimes we find situations where there's a joint family system. They may be living with the parents, you know, the family of origin, the elderly parents, for instance, maybe a mom who's widowed, and they want to all come as a family, and you've got to tell them, sorry, Canada still, to this day, just looks at the nuclear family and doesn't really take into account these cultural differences around the world, somewhat surprisingly. But yeah, so those are some of the options for Canada.
Great, thanks. And I'd say the same could be said for the US as well. At least immediately, it kind of takes a look at the nuclear, kind of the immediate family first. So kind of South Asian, widowed moms, things like that, not really taken into account usually in this instance. So, you know, a lot of the time people will come in on B visas, things like that, but we're not talking about that yet. Mala, what should Ravi do? He's trying to get into the US. Is there any kind of, he has his business that he wants to establish here? What should he do?
Yeah, I mean, definitely we have a lot of different investor options in the US as well. A lot of people like to do E2s, what Ravi mentioned. Unfortunately, Indians cannot do E2. We don't have a treaty, but there has been a huge influx of EB5 recently because of all of the changes that we've had this year. I recently saw some statistics that the most international students coming to the US are from India, and about 5% of those are people who are from families that will qualify for EB5. So there's definitely an interest in the investors coming almost for the sole purpose of giving their children a pathway into the US work market. For EB5s, what changed in July is, well, like all changes with immigration, when they give you something, they take something away. So at least in the US. So with the EB5, they
like,
increased.
I don't know what that means.
You know?
Ravi's like, all's good in Canada.
So in this year, they increased the amount of investment that's required for EB5. So if you're in a targeted employment area, rural area, it's 800,000 and employing 5 US citizens, or it could be 1.1 and you're employing 10 US citizens. However, the exciting part is now after COVID, the regional centers are open again. So you're not required to do a direct investment, which is a business you would be required to be here and manage. You could contribute to a project through the regional centers and still continue, you know, if you don't want to live here permanently all the time. So the regional centers being open is huge for EB5 investors. And the second huge thing is if you happen to have another visa status and you're in the US, you can now apply for the EB5 and your adjustment of status, your green card petition simultaneously, and sit and wait in the US. And while you're doing that, your children under 21 are able to enroll in school and public school. And it's almost like you have the benefits of having a green card while you're sitting here waiting. So previously you had to wait abroad. So this is really exciting for a lot of.
Mala,
EB
we talked
professionals.
about, there's like a 10-year wait to get your green card for the EB2, EB3. Would there be a wait here?
I
Permanent
think
residence?
so. I mean, it's definitely streamlined, you know, we're
Yep.
hearing stories about, I mean, if you're waiting abroad, I believe it's 7, 8 years, but if you're waiting in the US and you go through regional center, I mean, there's a lot of factors that affect it, but you could potentially have it in a year or two.
That's amazing, right? Because if you're an Indian born, that's kind of cuts through all of that. Now, Mal, if let's just say you have a business in India already, is there a way to kind of open up shop in the United States if you have a business in India and you're like, you know what, I want to take my family from India, I have my company here, but I want to open up operations in the US. Is there kind of a thing there going on? Can you talk
Absolutely.
about?
You could do an L1A new
Oh,
company
okay.
office in the US. There's a lot of requirements. You definitely have to have an actual brick and mortar office open. But yeah, that's definitely an option, and it's a quick option. And so you can come in on an L1A. And then after a year, you have to get the restriction removed. And then after I believe it's 6 years, you can get a green card or sooner.
But doesn't
Yeah.
it matter like how big the company is in India? Like would you take a case if there was just one employee and you know what I mean?
No?
Yeah,
It's got to be sizable.
Yeah.
I mean, I would say the bigger the company in India, it's easier to make a case that you're going to have a U.S. office going to be valid, have employees, because we're going to have to propose like a business plan, and that business plan looks a lot better with more capital in it, and kind of we can show that, you know, after 2 years, because we're going to have to renew the L again, and after that period of time, you know, we're going to have these many employees and all of that stuff, right? So if you have a big hub in India, I'm just going to say Tata because it's easy. Tata will have no problem opening up a new office in the United States, right? And that petition itself. But if you have, you know, 3-person shop in India, want to expand to, you know, 2 people here, they're going to start questioning whether this is going to be a valid business or not, right? And then the L1 gets kind of tricky to adjudicate in the US. So if you have a bigger, I think the case is stronger. Regulation wise, you could file the case possibly, but the cases are stronger if you have a nice big business you can lean on back in India.
I mean, I think okay. Well, that's definitely been a change in USCIS because in the last few years, because, you know, 10 years ago, it would be like a mom and pop yoga studio sponsoring one person to come to the US and do yoga classes, and they would get their L1A and they would get their green card. But I think since 2015, USCIS has definitely cracked down and wanting to push those people more towards E2, which of course India does not have a treaty for, but they definitely want it to be the bigger corporations. They want to see millions of dollars in revenue. They want to see at least 10 employees in India. Right. So it's really, I get a lot of calls from small business owners in India who want to do this, and it's not an easy battle. Yeah.
I just want to say one thing. One thing Canada is not very good at is having a way for people who are self-employed as business owners to transition to permanent residence. So, you know, if you're coming in on our version of the L1, the intercompany transfer from India, let's say, and you are the business owner, one thing we have to advise is to think about salarying, you know, getting a salary for yourself and maybe getting some other person who's also got some control, maybe seating control, so that you'll have only 49%, so that we can then honestly characterize you as an employee. And then I often go to the Canada Revenue Agency, our equivalent of the IRS, and I get an opinion from them confirming that the person is considered an employee. Of course, they like to give those opinions because, you know, they want to take that tax as an employee. Then we file with the person as an employee as opposed to someone self-employed. So that's something Canada's not very good at, even though obviously these people are coming to Canada and it's a great boon to Canada. It's you know, they're creating employment. You want to have some way of transitioning them, but I think they don't want to compete with the existing business streams like the startup visa, like I talked about, and others. So I think that's part of the rationale there. But we actually do have a question And I think the question is the TN visa still out there? So Canadian citizens can drive down to the United States, start or run a business in the United States and leave if it fails, but unable to become a PR without a path like H-1B. So I think the confusion here is that if we just substitute TN with E2, I can make sense of this question.
Right.
But TNs are for specific occupations, and they're enumerated and they're described, and you generally need to have a job offer. So it's not really about starting a business. I mean, you could be a management consultant, consulting with an existing business, but really it's about having employment. But an E2, which is about getting a work permit on the basis of investing, or having a Canadian citizen who's invested in a US business, and maybe you're a key employee or something. Again, that's fine, but you're right. If it fails and you come back to Canada, fine. If you're the one investing, but you can't transition to PR, to, I guess they're saying PR, but green card, with I guess just having a very basic business, a couple of employees, $300,000 of gross revenue. That's not going to make it in terms of a green card, is my understanding.
Well, I think the bigger issue in this question is non-immigrant intent versus immigrant intent. So TN visas are temporary, and non-immigrant intent, they can only be up to, I think it's 3 years, and then you have to have a plan to go back. Whereas in H-1B, you can have dual intent. H-1B is a non-immigrant, but you can have the dual intent of having your green card petition on file. So, so that's why, I mean, the transition between TN straight to green card.
Yeah, I guess they can't say they're gonna obviously don't want to say at the border, hi, I'm applying for a TN and I'm going to be staying here forever. By the way, I got my U-Haul of stuff, and the plans to, so obviously that's the problem with the TN. But if we substitute TN to E2 and the person's really coming in as an E2, then that's not so much of an issue, right? Because even though the TN is theoretically renewable indefinitely, whereas the E2, they give you a few years, then you kind of renew in 5-year blocks subsequently. I mean, so technically they're both renewable indefinitely. There's still a bit, there's not as much of an issue, I understand, with the E2 as the TN in terms of.
Well, I mean, so first of all, the TN will be, employer sponsored, right? So let's just put that out there, unless it's a management consultant, even the management consultancy will sponsor the TN, right? So, it's not that you can get a TN, buy or run a business. It's not exactly how it works. You kind of need an employment-based sponsored TN, right? Once you get here on TN, your intent can, when you make that entry into TN or you get into TN, your intent should be single intent, as Mala says. Now, are you allowed to change your intent while on TN? You absolutely are. So there are pathways even on TN to get to the green card, but it really depends on timing. So, as Mala said, you get 3 years initially on TN. So if you start the green card process, you should have the green card by the time you're ready to renew again, right? So
also, if you're going back and forth, the Border Patrol is going to know you have a petition pending.
Right. So kind of, if you're an Indian, if you're Indian born, all of that stuff, you can't have an adjustment status filed pending while you're on TN. So you really have to make the timing right. If you are a TN, you have to file around 40, file your adjustment status when you have the full 3 years, because you really can't travel. You're kind of landlocked once you file your adjustment status of the green card application when you're on TN. So there are pathways, but it just gets a little tricky. And yeah, I mean, H-1B is like the best way to get there, as Kulvinder, kind of alludes to. But there's pathways, but as Mala says, there's single intent. So once you get here, that intent can change, but you don't have a lot of time as an Indian born person to get that green card, right? So I'll get to the next slide now for time's sake. We'll get to the questions, kind of actually the rest of the questions at the end. So the next one is Rohit and Rahul. I'm Rohit, obviously, and it's Halloween, guys, so let's have some fun. This is Rahul, and we're gonna both spin the wheel. Let's go. Whoa, what happened here? Now, Rohit and Rahul are going to college. I'm going to the United States, and Rahul, cool guy, is going to Canada. Now, we're going to college, and kind of the decisions of where to go, how to pick, all that stuff comes into play, right? So Ravi, can you talk about Rahul and what he should be thinking about when picking college? He's thinking about going to college and all of that stuff.
Yes, and it's interesting because a lot of people tell me in India, some of the private colleges are more reputable than some of the public ones. And in Canada, it's the inverse. So what happens is, you have to have what's called a designated learning institution. Your school, educational institution, I'll call it, would have to have that designation. But it gets extremely complicated because in Canada, we have all of our major universities, what you call colleges, we would call a university. All of our major universities are in part publicly funded by the state. Okay, so the universities are all very similar in that sense, and you don't have like wide discrepancies in terms of the reputations. Sure, some are more reputable than others, but generally they're all like at a decent level. I know in the States there's multiple tiers, right? And then you have the community college system, which is the technical college system, when you're learning how to do technical things like technologists or cooks or bakers or whatever. And those community colleges are also publicly funded institutions. Within those, some of them and some specific programs, it gets even more complicated because even within the same institution, even if they're a DLI, so they're approved,
right,
some of them will allow for you to get the coveted work permit upon graduation, what we call a PGWP, a postgraduate work permit, and some won't. And if you graduate, so when I'm advising you in terms of whether or not, which schools to go to and what you should look for, I would say, don't pick a one-year program, because a one-year program gets you a one-year work permit. But if you go, there's no point going to 3 or 4 if you're looking at the community college system, because anything over 2 years gives you a 3-year work permit.
Oh.
Now, of course, if you're going to university, it's different. They're generally 4-year programs. But if you're looking at the technical community college level, you want to go for a 2-year program. So that's length. I already talked about how you got to be very careful to make sure it's a DLI, designated learning institution, and you got to be careful that even within the community college system, some programs qualify, some don't. The other thing I want to flag here is that, and I'd love to know if this is an issue that you guys have encountered, but in Canada, what we have is we have non-lawyers that are able to practice law. And you don't have that in the United States. You call it the unauthorized practice of law. But we, like other Commonwealth countries like the UK and Australia, have been experimenting with allowing non-lawyers to actually engage in the full practice of law. And so we have a whole unregulated system in India where there's agents or consultants who are not even the registered consultants, and they certainly aren't lawyers. And they're pushing people to, because they get very lucrative commissions, to go to some colleges which are now private colleges that are affiliated with the public community colleges. So what happened is, in Canada, it's shot up. So there's a dramatic increase in the number of international students in the last 5 years. It's been more than a doubling. It's an enormous industry. It's $23 billion industry. And the folks involved in it are pressuring the federal government and the provincial government, and they're really lobbying to get more international students. Now, the colleges don't have the room, and so they're oversubscribing students. And what they're doing is, in the community college system, they're partnering with private colleges who are operating in strip malls and have terrible experiences for international students. And they're partnering with them, and so the students come there, and they sometimes arrive in Canada and they don't even have a seat, and there've been protests, and it's been a bit of an uproar. So,
right,
all of which is to say that you've got to be very careful. Some private colleges are affiliated with community colleges, and you are going to be able to get a postgraduate work permit afterwards, but they're very poor in terms of the educational experience. And so this is a problem that is really, being felt right now. We have funeral homes that are, in the Brampton area where there's a lot of Indo-Canadians, a lot of international students. They're sending kids home in body bags. I mean, they're committing suicide because they've come here, they don't have a seat, or they're not able to graduate because they're working too hard and they're not fulfilling their program requirements, and they're ashamed of the fact that they've spent all their parents' money and they're going home body bags. So I could talk forever about this, but I would just say that this is it's an issue that I'm particularly kind of passionate about right now. And you got to really be careful, and you got to choose wisely, and you got to be wary of the agents in India that are telling you guaranteed you're going to get, a first-class education, or guaranteed you're going to get permanent residence afterwards. Those things are not necessarily guaranteed. And I'd love to know from you guys if you're also experiencing this, where agents in India are pushing US schools, and are they, I know there's been some fraud, but I mean, some schools not being valid and all that, but I mean, is there like an epidemic like we have right now in Canada?
I don't think, Smala, I don't think so, right? I mean,
I don't think so.
obviously, I would say there's these agents or, entities that push these CPT programs, the master CPT programs, that are basically mills to provide work authorization to individuals. There were a couple of FBI stings there, I think a year or two ago, with a couple of these programs. So what they'll do is take the money, and then they'll have a job, and they'll take certain cuts of that job, and they'll give them a degree at the end of it. But
Well, they're not even studying.
they're not studying.
Okay.
And, they're enrolled in class, they'll get a book or something, and then nothing's going on. And then what happens is later on, or even during, if the US government kind of catches you, the person gets in trouble as well, right? So Rohit, let's just say, who went to the United States on, he thought he was going to enroll in a master's program for computer engineering, goes there and there's nothing really going on, but he can work, right? So there is that going on. I can't say for sure if it's rampant or if it's an epidemic like in Canada. I can't say that, but there's that going on, which is like, it's the same thing, right? They'll take the money and kind of give you work authorization, and then you can get, even if you get H-1B later on, if the government looks at your transcript and sees your record, we've had cases where they say, well, you went to this school. What happened here? Did you actually go here? And then the H-1B gets denied. So, I mean,
I've had it where that exact same situation, the school got turned down. She got her H-1B, she had a job. She just went to India to visit her family after 6 years and to get the visa stamp in her passport. When she came back, Border Patrol took her phone, looked at her resume, said, you went there, you're not qualified for H-1B. You obtained this under false, and they sent her back, and now she has a 5-year bar. So we just submitted her waiver.
Well, what if when they got there at the United States, they generally thought they were going to go to the school, and then they realize it's all fake, and then they do something. If they come to the attention of the authorities, or they, if they say, yeah, this I've been scammed here, I'd like to now go to a different college. Is it possible to do that?
Yeah, you can transfer an F1 student.
Okay, so some of these, so I guess in the eyes of the US government, they were complicit essentially.
If they don't say anything, right? If
they don't say anything, right? Okay.
And kind of get on H-1B and nothing happens, and but it's hard to say, oh, I'll just transfer to another school, spent $30,000 giving X university money. So it is hard. So that aspect of it. So
yeah, in that case, there was an expedited removal transcript from the airport that is just brutal. It's like you just continue to move around to stay in status and F1, and you've lied on every job that you've ever got, and you're not qualified. And so they dug deep.
Wow. Okay.
H-1B.
Yeah. it's tough. But you know, in the other sense of it, in terms of, you know, Robbie, you mentioned there's different levels of universities and all of that, and tiers and technical colleges and all of that. But I would say, if, you know, if you're going to university or college here, most of the time you can get the OPT, which is Mala had mentioned earlier, the optional practical training for 1 year after your program. And then if you're a STEM program, as Mala mentioned last time again, you get 2 extra years on top of that after graduation.
And not every school is like, I guess SEVIS it's called, right? Is
Right.
approved for immigration purposes to get the F1 student visa. I mean, not every school is SEVIS approved, right? I mean, you have to
Right.
be a
They
decent
need to have
school,
a
is that fair?
DSO, designated school official, stuff is approved within the program. But you know, so you know, you'd have to do your research there. But if you're at like a major university, or you can look at accreditation as well for that. So yeah, so you know, there's sites and all of that for accreditation. So you do your research beforehand, I guess. But for your purposes, what you're talking, it's not as rampant as it is there. There's, you know, the problem here is that after college, after those 3 years, let's just say you did a STEM degree, you know, what's happening after that? You need that H-1B really. And if you don't, you go back to the slides up top before.
Okay.
So we're gonna go to the next one. Timing is getting tighter. So Lalu is, I guess I will be that. He's gonna spin that wheel, and he is getting an arranged marriage. So there's 2 scenarios here. One, he's already in the United States, and then 2, he is in India as well. Or sorry, the spouse is in the United States, and the other scenario is the spouse is in India, right? So Ravi, do you want to kind of go across the Canadian side, and Mal and I will tackle the US side?
Sure. Well, I mean, we do things a bit differently in Canada on this issue as well. You know, my understanding is in the US, if you've been married a certain time, then they may not check on you down the road. But otherwise, if you've just been married a short amount of time, it's conditional. Essentially, you're a green card. And I think that you can correct me if that's wrong, but in the United Kingdom, I believe it's the same. In Canada, it's very different. So we do not have conditional permanent residence. And so once you get your permanent resident visa and you come, that's it. There's no checking. And as a result, when it comes to arranged marriages, it's simply not good enough to do a registered marriage. Now, I can tell you that I would say 90% of the people who approach me say, Ravi, you know, I want to do a registration, like a registered marriage, because really what I want is that once we actually get married and have the religious ceremony and all that, let's say a year later, I would like my spouse to then immediately come to Canada, right? Let's say if it's a female in India, you know, culturally she's joining the boy's family, you know, and so they want that to happen culturally right out after the wedding. And so they come up with this idea, well, let's just do the registered marriage and we'll do the religious stuff down the road, but let's just do the registered marriage just to get the papers going. Now, if I had a nickel for everyone who thought they were coming up with this very innovative solution and way to game the system, or way at least to work the system, you know, I'd be very wealthy, because, you know, everyone comes up with this. And what I have to do, and sometimes I see people who've done this, and then they've got a refusal and I've got to appeal. But if they approach me early enough, I tell them, do not go ahead with this registered marriage, right? Do the whole marriage. And if you have key relatives that aren't going to be there, according to your planning, like a sibling, your only sister is not going to come, you know, I mean, it's one thing if she's got a family and it's very expensive and she's immigrated somewhere else, I can, you know, young kids, maybe I can sort of get it. But why did you schedule your exam in the middle of your sister's or your brother's, or why'd you schedule your wedding in the middle of your brother's exam schedule in April? right?
Right.
Why did you do that? How come your dad's coming but not your mom? Or, what was so urgent that, was taking her from,
And that comes out in an interview or?
well, so what happens is what happens is they ask those questions on the forums, and the forums are designed in this particular area to sort of trick people up and to sort of catch people. So they ask very detailed questions on the forums, and if they're not satisfied, they could have an interview. And of course, they interview separately. And eventually, because the person's nervous. I mean, again, the amount of times, especially people from the villages and more rural areas, the officer says, "Well, what did you like about the person?" And they say, "Oh, I like their nature." And it just drives me nuts, because it's not the sort of, answer that an officer who's, a Caucasian officer who is not from, the culture and doesn't appreciate it fully expects. They expect to know, like for the person to wax poetic as to all the wonderful romantic qualities of their spouse and why they married them, and to know, by the way, of all the history. So they look at things like, is the age compatible? So they'll, is the boy a couple years older? Because they do think of them boy and girl, right? Is the boy a couple years older? Are they from the same religion? Is their education level similar? That they're both masters, or, does one maybe have a entry to practice degree, like a dental degree, and the other is an MBA? Are they from the same region in India?
And these are all questions asked on the form.
These are all things that they're going to look into. Is someone divorced? Does someone, have kids? Is there a large age difference? And they don't like it if the female is older than the male, interestingly enough. They think that that's a red flag. So there's all kinds of, it's very cookie cutter. And it is discriminatory, because, India is this huge country. And, the second marriage for someone divorced in Mumbai, urbanites, there may be a very different scenario than another part of India. Cousin marriages come up. So there's all kinds of things that come up. But, another thing I want to raise is just about the visitor visa. So sometimes people have a pending application and they want to see if they can come in as a visitor. Particularly from India, it's challenging, because they do want to assess the merits of the marriage before they give that visa. Because after all, as I said, once they issue the permanent resident visa, that's it. There's no more inquiry. But if they are able to come here, let's say they have an Indian background, but they're actually a British citizen, and they can come, without requiring a visa, then it's possible to do what we call an inland application. And that gets the person potentially a work permit, being able to work while the application's pending. So there's, for some people who can get visas, or who are able to come in because they're a citizen from a country that doesn't need a visa, they can process the case from within Canada. Otherwise, you're processing the case from outside of Canada. And the last thing I'll say here is that there is a right of appeal only for those cases processed at the visa office, not for those processed within the country.
Okay.
And unlike the United States, you don't need advance parole, special permission to leave and come back. That's not problematic.
It sounds like there's also, unlike the United States, a condition on the green card for the first 2 years if you've been married.
That's right. There's no condition whatsoever, which is why it's so important to paper this thing. Because if you just have a very simple registration and a couple of photos and you're like, give me permanent residence. Well, if it's that easy, there's 1 billion people in India that are, more than happy to contract with you as a Canadian permanent resident to sort of have that marriage certificate and come on in, right? So because of that, they get into all this bogged down stereotypes and stuff, right? Because they're trying to ferret it out. They're trying to uncover the fraud. So it does make the system kind of complex, and then what happens is that they are refused. What I've noticed is I'm winning cases, on appeal, because again, there's a right of appeal if you process the visa office.
Right.
We're winning. I've always had a track record that was, near 100%. Now, is that because I'm a great litigator? It could very well be because, the person who is appearing at the tribunal in Canada is the Canadian, right? And that Canadian is going to be able to speak very eloquently often, and they're not the nervous person who's being sponsored maybe from a village who is encountering a visa officer for the first time. So again, there's part of that dynamic is
Right.
that you've got the Canadian in front of you, and the Canadian's saying, "Hey, what's
Yeah.
going on? Like, this is my spouse,"
Right.
and by then we were able to prepare them better too. But so
It's
the
not
point I'm
a,
trying to make is there's a lot of refusals of very genuine cases, and they've even refused people with children before. So it goes to show you how nuts some of the stereotyping can get.
yeah, I thought Canadians were like nicer. What's going on there? No, I feel like for the US system, I'm shocked with those questions, the religion and the age and all of
Yeah.
that. I don't think that comes up really. So if your spouse is in the United States, and they're in some sort of status, valid status, you can file for an adjustment of status, almost right away. But
Mhm.
if you're married for under 2 years, you'll have that conditional green card, like you said. But over 2 years, it's a full 10-year green card.
Mhm.
We've had cases recently where they haven't even had the interview, the Stokes interview, where you go in and they kind of ask vote. So, which is kind of crazy. But usually that's the case. You'll get the interview, both go in, and they'll ask you questions at that time. But when you're applying for the green card, I mean, that type of analysis that you just mentioned with the age and the religion, all of that, I don't, we're not having to prove that. We're not having to prove why the brother wasn't at the wedding, and things like
I've
that.
actually had that in a lot of my marriage interviews, and it's definitely
Yeah.
a red flag if they're more than 20 years apart. It's not an automatic denial. You just have to
Yeah, it's
explain
not on the
it.
forms, which is what I was
It's
trying to
not on
say,
the
which is
forms,
crazy,
yeah,
like
but
declaring a religion on a government, like it's
yeah.
crazy. So sorry, go ahead, Mo.
Yeah, no, but like the age difference is obvious and they're going to ask about
Yeah.
it in the interview. I've been in, where it's an Indian couple and, they texted and he went there and they got married in 3 weeks. And she was like, what's the rush? Who was there? Having to explain, really in depth
Mhm.
about why they decided to get married. And then that was just for removing the condition, that interview. And we had to go through the whole thing and explain how they really are legitimately married and what things they enjoy doing together and really justify it.
Yeah, and I think another interesting thing is, let's see, you're doing your interview in New York versus Texas or
Yeah.
another part. The adjudicators will be a little bit different, a little meaner, a little nicer, depending on what part of the country you are from here. So it's a little interesting thing where you live, and how that kind of those politics work in their mind, because they can ask those questions. If you're from Texas, you're gonna ask different questions sometimes than if you're from New York. So I think it's a little interesting. We're running out of time a little bit, so we're going to kind of cruise past this game of life and go past the speed limit in our cars. And Priyanka, why don't you spin that wheel?
All right, let's do it.
So we have 5 minutes left. We do want to take some
Okay, here we
questions.
go. No wigs, just
No wigs, just the cat
Okay.
ears. Let's do
Yeah,
it.
she's
Here
the
we go.
girlfriend. She followed her boyfriend to the US. They fell
Right.
in love.
Fell in
She-
love, but fell out of status.
I
Right?
know, she couldn't bear to
Priyanka
leave.
has a boyfriend, Nick Jonas, and fell out of status. So lightning round, I guess, guys. Canada lightning round. What can she do now?
Well, I don't know if Nick's Canadian or a permanent resident, then
Mhm.
potentially if they've been living together anywhere in the world for a year, we can do a sponsorship as a common law partner. So they don't need to be married, or if they got married, that's another option to get immigration. So I do that all the time for people who are out of status. They happen to be in a relationship with a Canadian or a permanent resident, and then we do them that way. But I'll just give a heads up that the mandate letter from the Prime Minister to the Minister of Immigration said, quote, the Minister of Immigration should further explore ways of regularizing the status for undocumented workers who are contributing to Canadian communities. So so that's coming. And the early reports are they're going to target about 500,000 people who are working here without status. And that would include those whose work permits have expired, refused refugee claimants, or those who are there for whom there's a moratorium that you can't be deported to your country because of war or whatever, or environmental reasons. Apparently, it's not going to be those with who have pending refugee claims. But that's coming. I mean, that's directly from the Prime Minister's mandate letter. So it could be that they stick around. And although as a lawyer we can't advise them to do that, but if they happen to stick around, they are working, which seems to be the key part, then we could be in a situation where we can regularize their status.
Wow, that's awesome. Mala, is there something that we can regularize our status with for Priyanka, or is
Oh my
she
gosh, I
kind
have so much to say in 3 minutes. I think that before her status fell out, she should have gotten an O1 visa for her extraordinary ability with
Yes.
all her awards, but she fell out of status. So now she just, I think her and her boyfriend need to get married so that she can adjust and her previous unlawful status would be forgiven as long as she didn't work in that period. But do you want to talk about the bars, 3 and 10 year bars?
Yeah, so there's 3 or 10 year bars that you should know about, that if you were out of status or out of for a certain amount of time, first period is 3 years, you're barred from the United States. Second period, I think, is what, if you're out of status for a year, you're barred for 10 years. So if you leave, talk to an attorney first, because if you've been out of status for, even if you think you've been out of status for 2 months, talk to an attorney before you leave and think you're going to fix the problem. Because you might have been out of status for more than you think. The I-94 gets tricky. TPS, if you're from Nepal, temporary protected status, there's that. If you're from Afghanistan, Burma, there's TPS is not available for Indians, but Nepal is South Asian and Afghanistan. Diversity lottery, again, Nepal, I believe, is within that. India is not. So those are some of the options that you can look at. But with Ravi can, with Canada, you can fix that situation, right? You can really kind of give them a work permit, all that. That's not really available easily or at all in the United States. So I thought that was interesting that, even if you're not married, you can kind of have that fallback as well. So we have 1 minute for questions. I think there's 2 of them. So we can address these questions now, or or a later time as well. Tara, what do you think?
You can go ahead and address them now. We started about a minute or 2 late, so if
Okay,
you
great.
2 are willing, if you 3 are willing to just
Sure.
stay on for a minute or 2, we can answer some of these. I think a lot of them are directed to Ravi. So
Okay,
Ravi, you're kind of on the hot spot here. The
no
first
problem.
First one is, can Canadian citizens apply directly for a green card if FN meets EB1C requirements and not do H1B or TN first?
This may be a US question.
Yeah.
FN, I think, is foreign national.
I'm gonna give a
Why don't
non-answer
you-
here. Yeah.
Okay.
So Canadian citizen, EB1C. EB1C is reserved for multinational managers. Means you have to be working abroad for 1 year, at least for the Canadian entity, in a managerial or specialized knowledge position. Before and the job itself, the EB1C, is in the United States in the same a managerial position. It's a non-answer because if you meet the regulatory requirements, you can technically apply, but you have to find an employer, you have to find a sponsor, you have to find an employer that's willing to just not put you on L first, but give you the green card right away. So without kind of transferring, you can go on L1 first and then apply for the EB1C. But I think usually what happens, the employer puts you on L1A and then you apply for the EB1C once you're here in the United States. This is an anomaly. If they love you, I guess they can. If you've been kind of with the company for years and years and years, you can apply for it. Mala, what do you think?
I agree with you. I have nothing more to add on that one.
And Ravi,
right.
I think that one's definitely yours.
Yeah, it literally says, hi, Ravi, what are your thoughts about upcoming changes which may be implemented next year for study permits? The minister mentioned they will have a system set up to encourage more students to apply in different provinces instead of coming to study in predominantly in British Columbia and Ontario. How do you think this will impact the process? That seems loaded.
Yeah, I mean, I don't like, it's interesting because the Constitution separates powers where immigration is shared with the provinces and the federal government, which is why you have provincially run immigration programs. But education generally whether it's universities or community colleges, is strictly a provincial head of power. So as a result, the minister can say whatever he wants, but at the end of the day, it's going to be the provinces that are, dealing with the students, number one. But number two, I mean, I just don't think that that's going to be the case, that we're going to have all of a sudden a moratorium, let's say, or restriction on students coming into our major cities, in our major provinces, BC, Ontario, et cetera. It's just not going to happen. It's a $23 billion industry, as I said, and the lobbying is very intense by these colleges and universities. So I don't see that at all on the horizon.
Great, thanks everyone. First, I want to thank our co-chairs, Ravi Jain, Rohit Biswas, and Mala Bajpai for their exceptional discussion today. It was a super fun session with great attendance, and we're very excited that I believe there's another session coming in the new year on somewhat different issues. So keep in touch with us. We will have a recording of this session put on the Saba North America website shortly after we're able to do so, and we'll announce it on social media. So thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thanks
Bye.
all.
Thank you.
Bye.